July 23, 1940, Patience Bay, off the coast of Karafuto, Japan. The submarine surfaced in absolute darkness, a steel whale breaching into enemy waters so close to shore you could smell pine trees over salt water. USS Barb's conning tower broke the surface first, seawater cascading off black metal that gleamed wet under starlight. No running lights. No sound except the hiss of compressed air and the low rumble of diesel engines coming to life. Inside the control room, Commander Eugene Fluckey stood with his hand on the periscope housing, counting seconds. 42 seconds surfaced and they hadn't been spotted. 43. 44. The Japanese patrol boats that prowled these waters were somewhere else tonight, hunting for submarines in deeper water, probably where submarines were supposed to operate. Fluckey wasn't interested in supposed to. Through the periscope, he could see the railroad tracks. They ran along the coastline maybe 950 feet from the water, a thin dark line cutting through the Japanese landscape, visible only, because he'd been studying reconnaissance photos for 3 weeks and knew exactly where to look. Somewhere on those tracks, a train was coming. Supply train, troop train, didn't matter. What mattered was that in approximately 90 minutes, those tracks were going to explode. "Surface party topside," Fluckey ordered quietly. "Demolition team prepare to disembark." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat. Then the submarine came alive with controlled urgency hatches opening, men moving through cramped spaces with practiced efficiency. 8 sailors assembled on deck, dressed in dark clothing instead of uniforms, faces smeared with engine grease to kill any reflection. They carried satchels of explosives, wire, pressure triggers, and 45 pistols that would be useless if they were actually caught, but made them feel slightly less naked. This was insane. Everyone knew it was insane. Submarines didn't conduct land raids. Submarines torpedoed ships, laid mines, maybe surfaced to shell coastal installations from offshore. They absolutely did not send sailors ashore into occupied Japanese territory within shouting distance of enemy soldiers to blow up trains. But Commander Eugene Fluckey had already proven he wasn't everyone. At 42 years old, he'd been commanding USS Barb for 18 months and had turned her into something the Japanese were starting to fear, not just another submarine, but a ghost that appeared where submarines shouldn't be, did things submarines couldn't do, and vanished before anyone could respond. He'd taken Barb into harbors that other commanders considered suicidal, surfaced in shipping lanes to shell coastal factories with the deck gun, sunk 30 ships using tactics that ranged from brilliant to borderline reckless, depending on who you asked. His crew worshipped him. Naval Command in Pearl Harbor had given him a Medal of Honor and politely suggested he tone it down. He'd nodded seriously and immediately started planning something even crazier. The rubber raft hit the water with a muffled splash. Lieutenant William Walker went over first, athletic, methodical, the kind of officer who could disarm a mine while explaining baseball statistics. Behind him came 7 enlisted men who devolunteered without really understanding what they were volunteering for until it was too late to back out. Fluckey watched them paddle toward shore, dark shapes against darker water. The coastline was maybe 200 yards away. Japanese territory, occupied for decades. There were fishing villages within a mile, military installations within 5. If a patrol came along the beach, if someone happened to look toward the ocean at the wrong moment, if anything went even slightly wrong, he pushed the thought away. Doubt was a luxury commanders couldn't afford. "Captain," the radar operator's voice crackled through the intercom. "Contact bearing 045. Range 8 miles. Closing." Fluckey's jaw tightened. Patrol boat, probably. Maybe destroyer. Coming fast enough to be a problem in about 20 minutes. The demolition team was already ashore, invisible against the tree line. They had 90 minutes to reach the tracks, plant 55 pounds of Torpex explosives under the rails, rig pressure triggers, and get back to the beach. 90 minutes to do something that had never been attempted in naval warfare, turn a submarine crew into commandos, and pull off a land-based demolition raid behind enemy lines. And now they had 20 minutes before Barb would need to dive to avoid detection, which meant the demolition team would be on their own, stranded ashore in Japan. Fluckey stared through the periscope at the dark coastline where his men had disappeared. This was either going to be the most brilliant operation of the war, or the most catastrophic mistake he'd ever made. March 1942, Imperial Japanese Navy Headquarters, Yokosuka. Vice Admiral Takahashi Ibo reviewed the submarine threat assessment with the kind of board efficiency reserved for paperwork that confirmed what everyone already knew. American submarines were a nuisance, clumsy, loud, poorly commanded. Their torpedoes malfunctioned. Their tactics were predictable. Their commanders operated with textbook caution that made them easy to avoid. The report on his desk detailed recent encounters. USS vessels lurking at predictable patrol depths. Periscope sightings in open water where any competent lookout could spot them. Torpedo attacks that missed because American commanders fired from too far away, too cautiously, too slowly. They fight like they're afraid of their own shadows, Takahashi remarked to his aide. It wasn't entirely untrue. Early American submarine doctrine emphasized caution: stay deep, stay quiet, attack from maximum range, escape immediately. Don't take risks. Don't get creative. Follow the manual. The manual was getting men killed and accomplishing very little. Japanese naval officers had taken to calling American submarines toy boats, not officially, but the nickname circulated. Small, timid things that made noise and occasionally got lucky. Nothing like the German U-boats terrorizing the Atlantic. Nothing approaching the strategic threat. By mid-1942, Japanese merchant shipping sailed with minimal escort in home waters. Why waste destroyer escorts on convoys that faced no real submarine danger? The Americans were out there somewhere, sure, but they were predictable, avoidable. This assessment was about to become catastrophically wrong. December 1943, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Commander Eugene Fluckey stood in the submarine briefing room, studying maps of Japanese-controlled waters with the intensity of a man planning a bank robbery. Around him, other submarine commanders discussed patrol areas, safe depths, standard approaches. Fluckey was thinking about railroads. He'd been given command of USS Barb in April 1943, a GATO-class submarine, 311 feet long, crew of 80, armed with 10 torpedo tubes and a 5-inch deck gun. Standard equipment. Nothing special about the boat itself, but Fluckey wasn't standard. He'd come up through the submarine service during the worst period, 1942, when American torpedoes were failing at catastrophic rates, when doctrine emphasized caution over aggression, when submarines were being used offensively instead of as the offensive weapons they could be. He'd watched good commanders play it safe and achieve nothing. He'd seen aggressive commanders get reprimanded for taking risks. And he'd concluded that the entire approach was backwards. The Japanese owned the surface, Fluckey told his executive officer during their first planning session. They have destroyers, patrol boats, air cover. We can't fight them head-on in open water, so we don't fight head-on. What do you suggest, sir? We go where they don't expect submarines to go, close to shore, into harbors, shallow water. We surface at night and use the deck gun. We stop fighting like prey and start hunting. His XO, a cautious man named James Webster, looked uncomfortable. That's not standard doctrine, Captain. Standard doctrine isn't working. Over the next 18 months, Fluckey proceeded to ignore almost every conventional submarine tactic and invent new ones. He took Barb into waters so shallow the keel nearly scraped bottom. He surfaced in harbors to shell factories and fuel depots with the deck gun, something most commanders considered suicide. He attacked convoys from positions where submarines weren't supposed to be able to reach. And he started sinking ships at a rate that made Pearl Harbor wonder if the reports were exaggerated. They weren't. Barb's first patrol, under Fluckey, 4 ships sunk. Second patrol. 5 ships plus a coastal installation destroyed by deck gun. Third patrol. Surfaced inside Namquan Harbor, a Japanese-controlled port, and sank 4 ships at anchor before anyone realized a submarine had penetrated the defenses. The Japanese started calling Barb something different than toy boat. They called it Akuma Demon. By 1945, USS Barb had become legendary. Fluckey's tactics had spread. Other submarine commanders were taking risks, getting aggressive, achieving results that pre-war doctrine said were impossible. American submarines had gone from nuisance to strategic threat, sinking Japanese merchant shipping faster than it could be replaced. But Fluckey wasn't satisfied. He'd studied every possible submarine tactic, every historical precedent, every unconventional approach. And he kept coming back to one thought. Submarines were limited by being submarines. They could only attack targets on the water or immediately adjacent to shore. Everything inland, factories, supply depots, transportation networks, was untouchable. Unless you stopped thinking of submarines as purely naval vessels. The idea had started as a joke during a wardroom discussion. Someone mentioned Japanese supply trains running along the coast, close enough to see from periscope depth. Someone else joked that they should blow up the tracks. Everyone laughed. Everyone except Fluckey. "Why couldn't we?" he'd ask quietly. The laughter stopped. His officers looked at him like he'd suggested they fly the submarine. "Sir," Webster said carefully, "submarines don't conduct land operations. We don't have training for demolitions ashore. We don't have equipment for. We have torpedoes full of explosives. We have sailors who can follow orders. We have rubber rafts." Fluckey's eyes had that dangerous gleam his crew had learned to recognize. "What we need is a target." He found one in Patience Bay, a railroad line running along the coast of Karafuto, carrying supplies and troops to Japanese positions in the north, remote enough that security would be light, close enough to shore that a small team could reach it, visible from the ocean, which meant they could time the raid. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Send sailors ashore in occupied territory, plant explosives on a railroad track, detonate them under a moving train, all while the submarine waited offshore in water too shallow for comfort, too close to enemy patrols, with no backup and no possibility of rescue if anything went wrong. Fluckey submitted the plan to Pearl Harbor, expecting rejection. Instead, he got cautious approval and a warning. "If this works, you're a hero. If it fails, you're court-martialed." "Understood, sir." Now, 3 months later, 8 of his men were somewhere ashore in the darkness of occupied Japan, carrying enough explosives to derail a train and probably get themselves killed in the process. And Fluckey was watching a radar contact close to firing range, knowing he might have to abandon them to save the submarine. July 23, 1945. Lieutenant William Walker's hands were shaking, and it wasn't from cold. He crouched in the tree line at the edge of the railroad embankment, watching shadows that might be soldiers, or might be rocks, or might be nothing. Behind him, 7 sailors waited with weapons drawn and explosives that suddenly felt very heavy. The forest around them was alive with night sounds, insects, wind through pine branches, the distant rumble of ocean waves. And underneath it all, a rhythmic vibration through the ground. Rails humming, train approaching, not yet. Not for maybe 40 minutes according to Fluckey's intelligence. But the tracks were definitely active, which meant the plan was still viable. Also meant they were 950 feet from safety. In enemy territory, with no idea if Japanese patrols were nearby. Walker had volunteered for this. Actually raised his hand when Fluckey asked who wanted to blow up a train. At the time, it sounded adventurous, heroic, the kind of story you'd tell grandchildren. Now it just sounded stupid. "Lieutenant," Torpedoman's mate Paul Saunders whispered beside him. "Tracks are clear, no guards visible." "We should move now," Walker nodded. Waiting wouldn't make this safer. He signaled the team forward. They crossed the open ground between tree line and railroad in a crouching run, 8 dark shapes against darker ground, hoping no one was watching, praying no patrol happened by. The embankment rose about 4 feet above the surrounding terrain. The rails themselves gleamed faintly in starlight, steel ribbons stretching north and south into infinite darkness. Walker dropped to his knees beside the tracks and immediately saw the problem. The rails were spiked directly into wooden ties with gravel ballast, standard construction. But the ties were thick, heavy, and the spikes were driven deep. They couldn't just lift a rail and slide explosives underneath. They'd have to dig. Saunders, Johnson, start excavating under the rail joint. We need space for the charge. Walker turned to electrician's mate Billy Hatfield. Rig the pressure trigger. I want this thing to detonate when the locomotive passes over, not before, not after. Hatfield nodded and pulled out the detonation mechanism, a pressure plate they'd improvised from torpedo components. Put enough weight on it, the circuit closed, the charge blew. Simple in theory. In practice, they were about to trust their lives and the entire mission to a device they'd de-built 3 days ago and tested exactly once. Saunders and Johnson dug with entrenching tools, working as quietly as possible, which wasn't very quiet. Metal scraping rock, gravel sliding. Every sound felt amplified, like someone was broadcasting their position to every Japanese soldier within miles. Walker kept his pistol drawn and his eyes on the darkness. If a patrol came now, they were dead. 8 men with sidearms against any number of soldiers with rifles, possibly machine guns. They couldn't fight, couldn't run fast enough to reach the beach. Their only hope was not being discovered. 15 minutes passed. 20. Got it, Saunders breathed. Space cleared. Depth is good. Walker pulled the main charge from his satchel, 55 pounds of Torpex explosive wrapped in waterproof canvas. Enough to vaporize a locomotive. Enough to kill them instantly if it detonated prematurely. He slid it carefully into the excavated space beneath the rail joint, feeling the weight settle against gravel and timber. Hatfield connected the pressure trigger, hand steady despite the circumstances. Walker watched him work crimping wires, testing connections, double-checking everything because there wouldn't be a second chance. How long until the train? Someone whispered. Walker checked his watch. 28 minutes, maybe less. How long to get back to the beach? 12 minutes if we run. Longer if we're careful. The math was simple and terrifying. They had to finish the setup, get clear of the blast radius, reach the beach, signal the submarine, and paddle 200 yards through open water. All before the train arrived. All without being spotted. And somewhere out in the bay, Barb was dealing with her own problems, radar contacts closing, patrol boats searching. Fluckey trying to decide whether to dive and leave them stranded or stay surfaced and risk the submarine. Triggers set, Hatfield announced quietly. We're live. Anything heavier than a man walking steps on this, we've got detonation. Walker stared at the pressure plate, now invisible beneath gravel they'd carefully redistributed. It looked exactly like undisturbed railroad track. A locomotive engineer would never see it. Never know that underneath his train, 8 American sailors had planted enough explosive to turn his entire convoy into scrap metal and memory. Cover the excavation, make it look natural. Then we move. Voices. Everyone froze. Japanese voices, distant but approaching. Walker's heart slammed against his ribs. He signaled silence, though no one was moving, barely breathing. The voices came closer. 2 men, maybe 3, speaking casually. Patrol? Railroad workers? Didn't matter. If they came close enough to see 8 Americans crouched beside the tracks. The voices continued north along the railroad bed, flashlight beams swinging casually, not searching, just walking. Routine patrol, probably, or maintenance crew checking the line before the train came through. They passed within 30 feet. Walker counted to 100 after the voices faded, before he allowed himself to breathe normally. Beside him, Saunders was white-faced even under the grease paint. "We need to leave," Walker whispered. "Now, before someone else comes." They gathered their equipment, double-checked that nothing was left behind, no tools, no wire fragments, no evidence except the bomb itself hidden beneath innocent-looking gravel. Walker took one last look at the pressure plate. 55 pounds of Torpex, enough to make history or make widows. They melted back into the tree line and began the careful, terrifying journey back to the beach. Behind them, the rails hummed louder. The train was coming. July 23, 1945, 2:31 hours, USS Barb, Patience Bay. Just black trees against marginally less black sky, and the thin line where ocean met land. The radar contact had turned out to be a patrol boat, small, slow, more interested in the northern approach than the bay itself. It had passed within 4 miles and continued on. "Captain," the exec's voice was tight with controlled tension. Fluckey didn't lower the binoculars. "They'll signal when they're ready. Then we'll have front row seats to the best fireworks show of the war. They know what they're doing, Jim." 8 men he'd sent ashore with explosives and hope, operating beyond any reasonable definition of submarine warfare. The water was glassy calm. Bow pointed toward open water for quick escape, but they were fundamentally trapped. Too shallow to dive quickly. Too close to shore to run. All they could do was wait. Fluckey swung his binoculars left. Relief flooded through him, immediately replaced by new urgency. Signal lamp. The signal light clicked 3 times, brief, controlled. On shore, the shapes reached the water's edge and began inflating the rubber raft. Even from 200 yards, Fluckey could see they were moving with desperate speed. He could hear it, a distant rumble growing louder, getting closer. "How long to get them aboard?" Fluckey asked. "Raft takes 3 minutes to paddle out. Another 2 to get everyone up the ladder. 5 minutes minimum." The train would arrive in less than that, which meant his men were about to be in the water, completely exposed, when 55 pounds of Torpex detonated less than 1,000 feet away. Lieutenant Walker hit the water at a run. Behind him, the rest of the team scrambled aboard. Too many bodies. They paddled with desperate efficiency. 200 yards. Walker tried to do the math in his head but gave up. They were going to be in the water when it blew. Either close enough to be killed by the blast or far enough to survive it. Mathematics wouldn't change which. 100 yards to the submarine. The train's headlight appeared in the distance, a single bright eye sweeping along the tracks, illuminating the coastal forest in stark whites and blacks. Walker could see the locomotive now, massive and unstoppable, pulling what looked like a long line of freight cars behind it. Troop train? Supply train? Didn't matter. In about 60 seconds, it was going to become modern art. "Faster!" Someone gasped, though they were already paddling as fast as physically possible. 75 yards to Barb. The train whistle blew again, long, mournful, unaware. The locomotive was moving at maybe 30 miles per hour, not fast but not slow. Enough momentum that even if the engineer somehow saw the bomb, braking wouldn't save him. 50 yards to the submarine. Sailors were visible on deck, reaching down toward the water, ready to grab the raft and haul them aboard. The locomotive passed over the pressure plate. 2:36 hours. The explosion was visible before it was audible, a flash of white-orange light that turned night into day for one impossible instant. Then the sound arrived, a massive crack that rolled across the water like physical force, followed by the deeper rumble of secondary explosions as the locomotive's boiler ruptured. Fluckey watched through binoculars, mesmerized. The locomotive simply ceased to exist as a functional object. One moment, it was a moving train. The next, it was metal fragments and steam expanding outward in a massive fireball. The first 3 freight cars jackknifed, tipped, and collapsed across the tracks. Something in those cars was burning fuel, ammunition, supplies, adding orange flames to the white-hot metal. "Jesus Christ," someone breathed behind him. The shore party reached Barb's hull 30 seconds after the explosion. Hands reaching up, sailors pulling them aboard with desperate strength. Walker came up last, soaking wet and grinning like a lunatic. "Clear the deck. Prepare to dive," Fluckey ordered. But he allowed himself 5 more seconds to watch the destruction. The train was completely derailed, multiple cars burning, the locomotive scattered across a 100-yard radius. Fires lit the coastal forest, sending smoke columns into the night sky. Behind the burning wreckage, more lights appeared: flashlights, vehicle headlights, Japanese response forces converging on the disaster. Too late, the Americans were already gone. "Dive, dive, dive," Barb's klaxon sounded twice. The deck watch dropped through the hatch. Water flooded the ballast tanks with a roar. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, leaving only foam and darkness behind. Inside the control room, Walker stood dripping seawater on the deck plates, breathing hard, still processing what they'd just accomplished. "Lieutenant," Fluckey said with perfect seriousness, "that may have been the most unnecessarily complicated way to sink a train in military history." "Yes, sir. Well done." The crew erupted in cheers, quiet, contained, but genuine. They'd done something no submarine had ever done. Conducted a land raid. Blown up a train. Survived. And somewhere on the Japanese coast, officers were trying to explain to their superiors how a train on land, on rails, nowhere near water, had just been destroyed by the American Navy. July 24th, 1945, 9:15 hours. Japanese Army Railroad Command, Karafuto. The locomotive, or what remained of it, was scattered across 50 meters of scorched earth. The boiler had ruptured so violently that metal fragments were embedded in trees 30 meters away. 3 freight cars had been completely destroyed. 2 more had derailed and were still burning. The rails themselves had been twisted into grotesque sculptures. This wasn't an accident. High-grade military demolition charge, buried beneath the rail joint. Pressure trigger, sophisticated design. The detonation occurred precisely when the locomotive passed over. The specialist shook his head slowly. "The explosive signature is American. Composition matches samples we've recovered from damaged American submarines. And look here," he pointed to marks in the gravel, "boot prints. American military issue, based on the tread pattern. Multiple individuals moving in coordinated formation." Matsuda looked toward the ocean, visible through the trees barely a kilometer away. A submarine had done this. An American submarine had somehow sent men ashore, planted sophisticated explosives, and destroyed a train carrying 400 troops and 3 months' worth of ammunition for the northern garrisons. The impossibility of it made his head hurt. Submarines couldn't attack trains. The entire concept violated basic military logic. Submarines were naval vessels. They torpedoed ships, laid mines in harbors, occasionally shelled coastal installations from offshore. They did not conduct land-based demolition raids. "Has Naval Command been notified?" Matsuda asked. They're having trouble accepting the report. They think we've misidentified the cause. Tell them to send someone to look at the crater themselves. Tell them to explain how a train explodes from the inside with American ordnance if it wasn't sabotage." Matsuda's voice was sharp with frustration. "And tell them the submarine responsible is still out there. Whoever had done this, whatever captain had been insane enough to attempt it, was somewhere in Japanese waters, unpunished, and now knew the tactic worked." July 26, 1945. Combined Fleet Headquarters, Tokyo. Subject: submarine-based land raid. Toyota read it 3 times, then read it again. Each reading made it worse. If submarines could conduct land raids, anything within a few kilometers of shore was suddenly vulnerable to attack by an enemy that could appear anywhere, anytime, and vanish before response forces arrived. "What's the defensive recommendation?" Toyota asked his operations officer. "But sir, ... The officer hesitated. Every patrol he tries something different. 12 patrols commanding USS Barb surfaced gun attacks on installations that should have been untouchable. The train raid wasn't an aberration. It was consistent with a pattern: a commander who refused to be limited by conventional thinking, who viewed every rule as a suggestion, and who had the skill and luck to make insanity look like genius. He submitted after-action reports claiming 30 ships sunk. The operations officer continued. Naval intelligence thinks he's exaggerating. If anything, he's undercounting. She's become one of the most successful submarines in the American fleet. Toyota closed the file and looked at the map on his wall, the vast Pacific. Now they weren't just offshore, they were on the shore itself. If submarines could blow up trains, what else could they do? Conduct reconnaissance? The Americans had spent 3 years learning that conventional submarine warfare wasn't enough. So they'd evolved, started taking risks that looked insane but produced results. August 2, 1945, USS Barb, transit to Pearl Harbor. 17 ships sunk this patrol alone. The crew was exhausted but victorious. Word had reached them via coded transmission. The train raid was being called the most audacious submarine operation of the war. Naval Command was simultaneously awarding commendations and quietly making sure no one tried to replicate it. Behind him, Lieutenant Walker approached. "I'm being promoted to squadron command. Barb will get a new captain. You'll get new orders. We'd follow you anywhere. You know that, right? Even the crazy stuff. Especially the crazy stuff." Fluckey turned to face his officer. They'd been lucky, impossibly, consistently lucky. Every harbor raid that should have gotten them killed. Every shallow water maneuver that should have run them aground. Every time they'd surfaced in enemy-controlled waters and somehow gotten away. And one perfect night when 8 sailors went ashore in occupied Japan and came back alive. "The Japanese called us toy boats once," Fluckey said quietly. "Called our submarines ineffective, predictable, not worth worrying about. They're not laughing anymore, are they? No, they're not. The war would end in 2 weeks, atomic bombs and surrender, and the sudden silence of peace. But here, now in August 1945, USS Barb was heading home as the most decorated submarine of the Pacific War. 17 confirmed kills this patrol. 60 plus over 12 patrols, 1 destroyed train, and a legacy that would be studied by naval commanders for generations. What happens when you refuse to be limited by what submarines are supposed to do? The Japanese had laughed at American submarines. Then USS Barb taught them nightmares have no depth limit. August 15, 1945. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. On the deck of USS Barb, tied alongside the pier at Pearl Harbor, Commander Eugene Fluckey stood apart from his crew, watching the sunset paint the harbor in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, Japanese submarines were surfacing for the last time as combatants. Japanese sailors were standing down. He thought about the train. A railroad command trying to explain to their superiors how an American submarine had blown up a train on land. The absurdity of it made him smile. The knowledge that war rewards innovation but punishes it just as often. That every successful mission had been balanced on the knife edge of catastrophe. That sending men ashore in occupied territory was either brilliant or criminal, depending entirely on whether they came back. They'd come back, all of them. Every time. "Captain," his executive officer approached quietly. "The Admiral wants to see you. Awards ceremony scheduled for tomorrow morning." He knew what was coming. More medals, more commendations, citations from the President. "Jim," Fluckey said without turning. Webster was quiet for a long moment. "We all came home, sir. That's the only metric that matters. But we could have not come home. If that patrol had spotted them, if the bomb had failed, if Napoleon had B-52s, he'd have won at Waterloo," Webster interrupted gently. "You can sift yourself into paralysis. What matters is what happened. We destroyed a train carrying troops and ammunition. We proved submarines can conduct operations beyond torpedoes and mines. and we survived to tell the story. Fluckey turned to face his exec. You think other captains will try it? After Naval Command saw the results? They'll write it into doctrine, sanitize it, turn it into procedures and training courses. 20 years from now, there'll be entire units dedicated to submarine-based special operations. They'll probably name a building after you. I don't want a building. I wanted to win. The surrender documents had been signed aboard USS Missouri. The war was over. Japan had lost. In a quiet office overlooking the devastated harbor, Admiral Toyota sorted through final operational reports. The numbers told part of the story: merchant shipping losses, fuel shortages, aircraft attrition. But numbers didn't capture the deeper failure. They'd stopped adapting. By 1943, they'd fixed the torpedoes and revolutionized the tactics. By 1945, they were conducting operations that redefined what submarines could accomplish. Meanwhile, Japan had started with the best torpedoes, the most aggressive tactics, and initial dominance. By 1945, they were still using the same approaches. The train raid report sat in Toyota's final documentation, a footnote to a larger defeat, but symbolically devastating. USS Barb had proven that American commanders were willing to try anything, risk everything, and somehow make it work. How do you fight an enemy that refuses to be predictable? That treats doctrine as suggestion rather than law? That views every limitation as something to be overcome rather than accepted? Toyota closed the file and looked out at Pearl Harbor, where American warships now crowded the anchorage. Somewhere among them was USS Barb, the submarine that had terrorized Japanese coastal waters for 18 months, that had sunk more ships than some entire squadrons. They'd called American submarines toy boats in 1942. They'd starved the home islands of oil, food, and raw materials. And USS Barb specifically had become legend, the submarine that went places submarines couldn't go, did things submarines couldn't do. Toyota had spent 4 years trying to counter American submarines. He'd never found an adequate answer. Mid-December 1945, Maury Island Naval Shipyard, California. The shark-mouth nose art painted for the train raid remained on the bow. Eugene Fluckey stood on the pier looking up at his former command, now someone else's responsibility. He'd been promoted, transferred to squadron command, given a desk and administrative duties. Important work, they told him. Training the next generation. But war was over, and peacetime Navy had no use for commanders who thought harbor raids were reasonable tactics. So he'd teach. Write manuals. Sir, a young lieutenant approached fresh-faced, probably 23, too young to have seen combat. I'm reporting aboard as Barb's new XO. Fluckey studied the kid. All right, Morrison, here's my advice. Fluckey pointed up at Barb. That boat has a reputation. 60-plus ships sunk. The crew expects excellence because they've seen what excellence looks like. I'm not finished. Fluckey's voice sharpened. If you want to be adequate, follow the manual. Morrison looked uncertain. Sir, isn't that risky? The question is whether you're willing to take smart risks or just safe ones. Fluckey softened slightly. But Morrison, the war's over. You'll probably never have to make those choices. So maybe safe is fine now. He walked away, leaving the young officer standing confused on the pier. 50 years later, the U.S. Navy would have entire units dedicated to submarine-based special operations, SEALs delivered by submarine. Demolition raids conducted from offshore, tactical flexibility that Eugene Fluckey would have recognized instantly. They'd teach his tactics at the Naval Academy, use USS Barb's operations as case studies in adaptive warfare. And somewhere in those lessons, buried in the analysis and doctrine, would be the simple truth that won wars. Never let your enemy define what's possible. END.